mentioned this morning I was going to be speaking about Zaccheus. I don't know if Josh picked that song because I said that or how that worked, but as we sang that, I was thinking a lot about Zaccheus. This song talked about how we're so weak and sinful and how Jesus welcomes us and those sorts of things. And those are some things that we'll see in our lesson this evening about Zaccheus. So if you want to turn in your Bible to Luke chapter 19, turn the page, so to speak, to a new chapter here. This is the chapter that will ultimately have Jesus entering Jerusalem, but we're still kind of on the way. We've been on the way to Jerusalem for a long time in this book, but we're just about there. Here in chapter 18, the chapter we just finished, we had some parables about prayer, the parable of the widow and how she was petitioning that unjust judge, and how through her persistence she had received a favorable response from that unjust judge. Well, how much more then will we, as we petition the God of heaven, a just judge? He'll help us swiftly. And the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, which will play into what we're looking at tonight, because of course Zaccheus is in that class of tax collectors. That tax collector and the Pharisee, the tax collector was praying very humbly, pouring out his heart out to God, whereas the Pharisee was arrogant and just saying how good he was and telling God, I'm glad I'm not like that guy, not like that tax collector. And of course, it says that the tax collector was justified in that case rather than the Pharisee. And we talked about the rich young ruler there in chapter 18 and how he had an opportunity to follow Jesus, but he was very rich and kind of passed that up because I couldn't give up his riches to actually change his life and follow Jesus. We'll see a contrast with Zaccheus with regard to that as well. And then, of course, we just looked at Bartimaeus, the man who was healed of his blindness. And that was as he was about to enter Jericho, and now he's in Jericho. So let's think about Zaccheus. We'll see 4 sort of ideas going on through here where Zaccheus makes this effort to see Jesus. He's seeking out Jesus. And then the other side of that equation is Jesus seems to be seeking out Zaccheus. He calls him to come and be with him. And then we have Zaccheus' response to Jesus, of course, a positive response, and then that leads to his salvation being declared by Jesus at the end of this short account here. So let's just read this together. It's from Luke chapter 19. It's just 10 verses. Luke 19, 1 through 10, and I'll be reading from the Legacy Standard Bible. And he entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man called by the name of Zaccheus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And Zaccheus was trying to see who Jesus was, and was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So he ran on before and climbed up in a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zaccheus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And he hurried and came and received him gladly. And when they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, He has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. But Zaccheus stopped and said to the Lord, Behold, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have extorted anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. So this passage begins giving us a little background of what's going on here. In verse 1, he entered Jericho and was passing through, as we mentioned before we started here. In chapter 18, verse 35, where we encountered the blind Bartimaeus, it says in chapter 18, verse 35, that he was approaching Jericho when that situation occurred. But now he's not just approaching it, he's in it. He's passing through it. And the next place he will be heading, of course, is Jerusalem. We're close to getting there. In verse 2, behold, there was a man called by the name Zaccheus, introduced to this person, and he was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. So, of course, we've talked about tax collectors before. We probably don't enjoy the IRS and the tax forms in our culture, but it was quite a bit worse as they think about this tax collector. They were collaborating with Rome. Rome had kind of taken over the country there. And so these tax collectors were sort of collaborating with Rome to collect these tolls and things. And so they were seen as collaborating with the enemy, so to speak. So they were traitors. And being involved in all that money, they were very often corrupt and taking more than they need to, and all this sort of thing would go on. So besides the whole very idea of it being a bad idea to a lot of people, they were being dishonest and stealing as well. And so Zaccheus is not just one of these tax collectors. He's the chief tax collector. And that's the only place in the New Testament where we read about this idea of a chief tax collector. And he's presumably the boss of other tax collectors in his area. So he would be the one who is sort of getting the contract from Rome and then administrating that through these other, however many other tax collectors under him, who collect all that and bring it through to him. So lots of money flowing through. So lots of opportunity to get rich and take more than you need, all that sort of thing. So he's the top dog. And so, of course, it says he was rich. Well, he was probably very rich. So our first point there, we want to see Zaccheus and his effort to see Jesus. In verse 3, we begin to see this. It says, and Zaccheus was trying to see who Jesus was and was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So like everybody at this time, with all the goings on and all the miracles and teachings and hubbub and controversy, all the things going on with Jesus, like Bartimaeus, the Zaccheus would have heard about these things. He would have heard about Jesus. He would have heard about Jesus' patience and compassion with those who are considered outcasts. In chapter 18, we just talked about how he healed that blind man, Bartimaeus. There was the parable there about the tax collector and his humble prayer and how he was ultimately the one justified in that case. It would give someone like Zaccheus some hope that maybe, what about me, he may be thinking. Look, earlier in Luke's account, chapter 5, back in Luke 5:27 and following, we have Matthew, who's called Levi, a tax collector, and he's called and he's following Jesus. Perhaps he's with him here in this situation right now. So maybe he's thinking, maybe Jesus can help me to get back on the right track with God. I'm an outcast and I've made some bad decisions, but I'm really, maybe torn between, well, I have these blessings, but what's the difference? Because everybody hates me or something like this. He doesn't maybe see the path to get back with God. But maybe I can be forgiven, just like the tax collector that Jesus talks about in his parable. So he must have had something in his heart for him to be seeking Jesus in this way. And there's a significance here, perhaps, to the way it says here, he was trying to see who Jesus was. The tense of that is sort of evokes an ongoing action. It's not just that, he tried to see. He's actively trying to see, perhaps over and over. Perhaps even, maybe I'm reading into it, but maybe in the course of all these events and teachings, maybe Zaccheus even took some trips trying to find Jesus. It kept missing him. And maybe there were crowds there and just, being a shorter guy, it never really worked out. But now Jesus is coming to his hometown. And so he's able to try to do that, but he's still a shorter fellow. Not necessarily maybe like suffering from dwarfism or anything, but you imagine crowds. If you're just a little bit shorter, you get up on your tiptoes, you're going to have a hard time to see anything. So regardless of how short he was, there was a struggle for him. And so he was trying and trying and trying to see Jesus, but he failed. And so, maybe we just give up. Be one reaction to that. Well, I'm trying to see Jesus, but it's not working out. But that doesn't seem to be his reaction. Of course, in verse 4, it says, as he encountered those problems locally with the crowds and everything, so he ran on before and climbed up into a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. So he's really determined to see Jesus. And so apparently he knows the route. It's probably the one route through town or something. And well, if he's coming through here, I'll take the shortcut and we'll get up ahead and we'll find this tree and we'll get up in there. And the trees in that area would have, this type of tree they're talking about, this sycamore fig or a fig mulberry, had good low branches that were kind of easy to get up in there. It's also said they had these leaves that maybe made him a little bit more obscured. Maybe he's even hiding up there. That may be speculation, but he's up there. He's trying to see Jesus. And he's able to do this probably unconventional sort of thing. Wasn't really a dignified thing for a rich man to be climbing a tree like this. But he really wanted to see Jesus. And I think all of these efforts that Zaccheus took, even though he was this tax collector and everyone looked down on him for that, it shows a measure of faith. And he's actually being active in his seeking of Jesus. So not only is he seeking Jesus, but then he's called by Jesus. Verse 5 says, and when Jesus came to that place where he's up in the tree here, he looked up and said to him, Zaccheus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. We probably, all of us or most of us, hear that song in our head, right? Zaccheus was a wee little man. And he came to the tree. Come down from there, all that. But we might ask, how did Jesus know his name? Had he heard about this notorious tax collector? Everyone knows the tax collector, and he's the chief tax collector. So this would have been probably notorious is a good word. Not just well-known, but, negatively well-known. And he would have been known to be short. So maybe it was Jesus had heard about that as he's entering town. And hey, there's this short, rich-looking guy. Maybe this must be Zaccheus. But of course, Jesus knows everything. We don't need to necessarily explain a scenario like that. We don't really know how that came about, but we know he knows everybody's name. He knows your name. He knows my name. We can think of examples like in John chapter 1, where Jesus, when he met Nathanael, he talks about how I saw you under the fig tree, and Nathanael was so in awe about that. Or when Jesus encountered the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4, he knew everything that she did. So we see Jesus can have foreknowledge about whatever he wants to know about. But the text doesn't know us for sure, but we know that he knows our name. He knows Zacchaeus' name. And Jesus calls out to him, kind of saying, essentially, I see you. Zacchaeus has been seeking Jesus, and now Jesus sees him. I see you, come out of that tree. As if saying, I know you. Maybe reading between the lines. I know what's going on with you. I know your heart aches to be right with God, and I know how hard you've been trying to see me. And who knows? Maybe you've been yearning to have a right relationship with God, and this is sort of describing you. And maybe someone in this room, or maybe someone who's listening to this or watching this as a recording, maybe you're seeking him. Maybe that's why you're listening today. Jesus is calling out to you too. The gospel, the good news, is certainly for all. So Jesus called, but how does Zacchaeus respond? What is Zacchaeus' response to Jesus? What does Zacchaeus do with this call? It's verse 6 here. He hurried down. He hurried and came down and received him gladly. Think back just a couple verses. He was running around to get ahead of the crowd and get into that tree, and Jesus tells him to hurry and come down. So he does. And Jesus tells him to come down. I must stay in your house today. And sure enough, he receives him gladly. He obeys in that. And I think that sort of represents a scene change. I don't see this all happening at the base of the tree. I think, I'm going to stay at your house, and then he receives him into his house. I believe he's receiving him in hospitality in his house there. And so we have a bit of a grand reception, perhaps, this rich man able to receive Jesus into his home. And at this point, we have a bit of a digression into the story here, just this one verse where we have Grumpy Gus and Judgy Jeff and Negative Nancy are all getting together here in verse 7. And when they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, "He has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. I don't like it. This isn't any good. That guy's no good. Why would Jesus do that?" And a lot of times, comments like this come from the Pharisees. And as I first read this, I just kind of assumed that's who was saying this. But as I read it again and again, that doesn't say that. It just says they all did this. Just the crowd. I mean, everybody hates the tax collectors, right? There was nobody who was enjoying the tax collectors except Jesus has a soft spot in his heart for them. But the general people were all against the tax collectors. So I think this time it's just the whole crowd. Everybody's just despising these traitorous tax collectors, and this guy's the chief of those tax collectors. I can't believe that Jesus is staying at that guy's house. What's he thinking? Well, thanks be to God that Jesus doesn't think that grumpy way, but rather he has this mercy and compassion on sinners, on us. If he didn't want to be around sinners, where would we be? Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. Well, being done with those grumps, back to our main point here, this third point, this response of Zaccheus to Jesus here. In verse 8, goes on to say, "But Zaccheus stopped and said to the Lord," and again, I'm suggesting this is in the context of his house and maybe this dinner, this time to be visiting with Jesus and others. "Behold, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have extorted anyone or defrauded anyone or cheated anyone," right? "If I've extorted anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much." So we really see here the fruit of repentance in Zaccheus. Being a tax collector, he probably did defraud people. But now he is trying to make it right. He's trying to get right with God and right with his fellow man. But remember the rich young ruler, right? He seemed to be perhaps a more respectable guy as he approached Jesus. He was said to be a rich young ruler. Suggested perhaps a ruler of the synagogue would be what that may be referring to. And he was explicitly said to be rich, as the name of the rich young ruler implies, right? What's the deal there? So back in Luke 18:22, we recall what it said there in Luke 18:22. "And when Jesus heard this, he said to him, 'One thing you still lack.'" This is where the rich young ruler had talked about how he'd followed all the commands, all the law of Moses, except he didn't mention about the "you should not covet." So Jesus adds this one thing. "One thing you still lack. Sell all that you possess and distribute it to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. And come follow me." But when he heard these things, he became very sad, for he was extremely rich. So as Jesus saw that covetousness in that rich young ruler's heart, he gave a specific prescription for that rich young ruler to follow, to give it all away, because it's eating your heart away or whatever. It's too important to you. But his response was, "Nope, I can't do that. I'm very rich. I can't give all that up," which was the whole point. You're valuing these things too much. But in this case, we don't see, with Zaccheus, we don't see Jesus having a speech like this and giving him a prescription. We don't really, the way it's portrayed here in Luke, we don't really see Jesus telling him much of anything other than, "Hey, get down of the tree. I need to go to your house," and stuff. Presumably, there was a conversation, but we aren't given that here. We're just given Zaccheus' sort of conclusion and his response. In verse 8 again, he stopped and said to the Lord, "Behold, half my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor." It makes us think of what the rich young ruler wouldn't do. Of course, he was told to give everything to the poor. Well, okay. But this is the Zaccheus coming up with this on his own. "And if I've extorted anyone, we give back 4 times of that." So Zaccheus is generous, being transformed in his heart from his previous ways. And he's making restitution is what this 4 times business is. That's something drawn from the Old Testament, the law of Moses, that he would be thinking about. If you go back to Exodus 22:1, there's actually a number of places where you can see if someone takes something they shouldn't have had, this or that, and there'd be different lesser amounts that they need to pay back. But this is the highest amount. In Exodus 22:1, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So it seems to be the 4 sheep for the sheep formula that's taken here for him to be saying, I'll pay back 4 times as much. And that's for this sort of the most horrendous of thievery, that where he is taking those things and destroying those things and not making them available anymore, like stealing someone's sheep and killing them. So he's on the right track to be right with God. And our final point in the lesson, of course, is how Zaccheus is said to be saved by Jesus here. So we may ask, what did Jesus think as a reaction here to what Zaccheus said? Verse 9 tells us, and Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. And this house is probably referring to, not his building he lived in, his house, but his family. There's good things coming to that family, that household, because the leader of that household is this man with a good heart, getting right with God and bringing salvation to the home. What once was lost has now been found. And he has the faith of Abraham. And of course, that's a concept rooted back in the stories with Abraham and his obedient faith that he had. And Paul brings that out, relating that even to Gentiles today. It's not necessarily a Jewish thing per se, because Paul makes the point that his faith was shown to be a righteousness even before circumcision was in the picture, for instance. So we can have that same sort of faith as Zaccheus and as Abraham here. And then the clincher verse for the whole thing is verse 10. And I've used this as a theme. I think it is a good theme verse for the whole gospel according to Luke. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. Well, thanks be to God for that, because the lost need saved. When we're lost, we need to be saved. We can't save ourselves. Even back when Jesus called Matthew, that tax collector, back in Matthew chapter 5, where the people had grumbled, there's this tax collector that Jesus is being with. Just like here, we see that same sort of grumbling. Back in Luke 5:31, and Jesus answered and said to them, it is not those who are well who need a physician or a doctor, right? But those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And that's really the same idea here with Zaccheus. He is the lost, and Jesus is seeking and saving the lost. So, a little bit of a shorter lesson. Zaccheus, we saw his faithful efforts to seek Jesus, to see him, and that resulted in Jesus seeing him in turn and calling him and having that interaction with him. He received him into his home and had this response to Jesus where he had a true repentance and changing his ways to give back, be more giving, and to make right those wrongs that he had done in the past, and being declared by Jesus to be saved, to have salvation. Of course, that's not the plan of salvation per se directly in the Christian age, but these concepts are certainly very pertinent for us to think about in our life too. We need to have that same faithful attitude, that same spirit of seeking Jesus and giving and repenting. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. Are you lost? Well, Jesus is for you. He wants to transform your life like Zaccheus had his life transformed. Do you need to obey the gospel? Is that something that you've not done? Submitting to baptism? Maybe you need the prayers of the church. Maybe you need to pray for forgiveness of sins. He's faithful and just to forgive us as Christians if we stumble. Maybe you'd like to study together about some questions you have that are troubling you. whatever it is, we encourage you to make those things right. We're going to sing hymn number 39, Is Thy Heart Right with God? If your heart is not right with God, we encourage you to make it right with God tonight as we stand and sing.